To all shall see these presents greetings. Now, if you've listened to the Man Battle Stations podcast for any length of time, or heck, even one of my other videos, you may have heard me referring to a given tabletop game as a Class A, B, or C game. And while I have explained what I mean by these classifications on my podcast, I haven't yet done a very thorough job of doing so on the YouTube channel yet. And since I'm looking to start covering more tabletop games here on the channel, the time seemed right to address the topic for those of you out there who maybe watch my videos but don't necessarily listen to the podcast. So over the course of this video, I'm going to explain why I have this system and what it is about. Then I'll examine each category in detail before finishing up on how over the years my thoughts on these classifications have evolved and grown somewhat. So even if you've heard my explanation before, hopefully this more in-depth conversation will provide greater understanding and maybe some food for thought. So up front, I should say that this ABC classification system has nothing to do with a game's quality. Instead, it's all about how available a game is. In other words, how easy is it to obtain a given game and, if it has them, the associated miniatures and other components. Just to reiterate, it's all about availability and not how good the game is. One might naturally wonder about why I would bother to come up with such a system. Now, the idea struck me about 6 years ago when I seriously started playing with the idea of starting a naval wargaming podcast. I was heavily influenced in this endeavor by the D6 generation. And like the D6G, I wanted to do detailed reviews of games on my podcast. However, unlike the D6G, I didn't want to just focus on the latest and greatest retail releases. Thanks to naval gaming being a niche within a niche, a majority of the naval games out there are just not available off the shelf at a retail store. And so I wanted to have a shorthand way of letting my listeners know just how available a game was in the event my review got them interested enough in a game that they were interested in picking it up for themselves. Now, I should also point out that this classification system can easily be applied to any game, not just naval games. However, given that this is a naval gaming-centric channel, this is where I'm going to be focusing my attention. Now, with that groundwork in place, I'll examine each of the categories in detail, starting with Class A. Now, Class A games are those that are currently in production and are widely available from most game stores. My stock explanation is that, as a gamer, you should have a reasonable expectation of walking into any random game store and seeing some evidence of this game's existence on the shelf somewhere in that store. Now, a company is actively making products for the game, and those products are being sold at retail. Major examples of current Class A naval games would include Star Wars Armada and Victory at Sea. These two games are very commonly seen on store shelves and are actively being distributed through the brick-and-mortar supply chain. Now, you may ask, why focus on physical stores? Well, given that the naval gaming hobby is still a very meat space-oriented activity, having a presence in stores that will in turn sustain a player base is an important consideration in my opinion. Now, Class B games are those that are still in active production and or are seeing new releases, but are generally only available online. There's a huge variety of games that fall into this category, especially in this day and age of self-publication and 3D printing. For naval gaming in particular, I think it's fair to say that the bulk of available games fall into this category. Why that is the case is an interesting question, and one that I might have to do a separate video on at some point. But it mainly has to do with the more limited appeal and market share naval games usually have, and it tends to limit their appeal in physical retail space. A couple of great examples of Class B naval games include Flick Fleets and Heart of Leviathan. Both of these fantastic games are passion projects for their creators, and are really only available through their own virtual storefronts. The number of Class B games grows even greater when you expand the aperture to include miniatures agnostic rule sets that are compatible with any number of different miniature ranges. This is something of a subcategory of game, as the barrier to entry for these is much lower given that there is no need to develop physical artifacts for the game, only a set of rules. Some great examples of this subcategory include Naval Command and Castles in the Sky. Naval Command is distributed via Wargame Vault, an excellent service that facilitates the self-publishing of wargaming rules and then makes them available on a well-indexed and easily used storefront. Castles in the Sky, on the other hand, is published through Osprey as one of their Osprey wargames. This means that the game can take advantage of Osprey's highly developed and well-established marketing, production, and distribution infrastructure. Despite the different ways these two games are produced and distributed, though, the key here is that both of these games are still available in print or digital form from their original author and or publisher, and don't have a specific set of miniatures associated with the rules. And now this brings us to Class C games. These are games that are out of print and are no longer available for sale from their original publisher. A game can enter this category in a number of ways. Sometimes the company that owns the game decides to end the sales of the product line. Battlefleet Gothic is a classic example of this happening. Another way that this can happen is if the game is based on a third-party intellectual property. If that company producing the game loses the license for that IP, then they will no longer be able to legally sell that game. A great example of this is the Babylon 5 A Call to Arms game. Warner Brothers pulled their license back from Mongoose Publishing, resulting in the game going out of print. The third main way that a game enters Class C status is when the company producing it goes out of business. The most painful recent example for me was the end of Spartan Games back in 2017. When the company went under, all of its games became Class C games and that their production immediately ceased. Now, having laid out all the categories, I want to now discuss how my thinking on this topic has evolved over time. One big thing that I've come to realize is that dividing games into one of three categories is not really telling the full story. Truth be told, when it comes to retail availability, games really exist on more of a spectrum than in discrete categories. So for example, it is reasonable to ask that if a game is available in some stores, but not all of them, is it really a Class A game? If not, then where do we draw the dividing line? Does it have to be 50% of game stores to reach the Class A threshold, or should it be more like 75%? You can hopefully see the problem. Especially in the more edge case scenario of naval games, far more games wind up in the, call it A- or B+ range than they do in the hard A range. I don't typically go into this much depth of discussion on availability in my podcast reviews for the sake of brevity, but it does bear keeping in mind when I start throwing around ABC games that a simple hard rating doesn't necessarily tell the full story. As for why naval games tend to struggle to reach the A category, well, that's a conversation for another time. Another thing that I've come to realize is that there's something of a game life cycle at work for many games out there. A game might launch and find initial success in stores as a Class A game. Over time, as the famously fickle gamer audience moves on to new hotness, the game inevitably winds up in the discount section and then exits the brick and retail mortar scene altogether. Then the game lives on as a Class B game, something that can only be purchased via the company's website, until eventually production and distribution of the game ceases entirely. At this point, the game becomes a Class C game and is only available from third-party resellers and online auction sites like eBay. This life cycle isn't a hard and fast rule. As I mentioned earlier, many games in general, and many naval games in particular, start as Class B games, for example. Likewise, this progression isn't always one way. There are examples of games that have gone from B to A, or even from C to A, as is the case with Dystopian Wars. These relaunches of shelved games are not unheard of, though they are a bit uncommon. That will do for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and sorry for the gap between the last video and this one. So, what do all of you think about the classification system I use? Do you think it's useful, and do you think there are changes that need to be made to make it better? Also, I'm always interested to hear from fellow gamers about their favorite naval games, especially the ones that fall into classes B and C. There's a world of semi-obscure games out there, and I'm sure that some of them are great, and I'd love to hear about them. Alright, well, until next time, this is Ruckdog saying good luck and good hunting.